table so we can start. My name is Micah. I'm the program director at Montana Women Vote. We're going to talk about a lot of things today, including workshop how to move policy forward in a community organizing sense. Before we start, though, because there's just a few of us here in the room, I want to do something to introduce us to one another. Say your name, why you're here, and also your preferred gender pronoun. When I say preferred gender pronoun, it's she, her, hers is mine. For some folks, it's they, them, theirs. For other folks, it's he, him, his. Those are a couple examples. And the reason that I want to do this is because it's really important to me in my community. And half of the battle of community organizing is respect. It's really difficult to pull communities together to lobby for a specific policy if we don't start from the basis and the basic building blocks of respecting the identities that we all hold. So I'll start so that we all have an example. My name is Micah. I'm the program director at Montana Women Vote. My preferred gender pronouns are she, her, and hers. Emily, do you want to go next?
Yeah, my name is Emily Likens. I'm the organizer at the Missoula Area Central Labor Council, and I use feminine pronouns, she, her. And I would also like to just really quickly inform everyone that MCAT is recording, and we thank MCAT for being here and providing us with a media assistance grant. We're really happy to have the opportunity to record everything that happens here and use it in the future. And if you have an organization that wants some training done, maybe we can get you some footage.
Cool.
But yeah, thank you.
Go. You want to go next?
Yeah, my name's TJ Bryant. My preferred gender pronouns would be he, him, his.
Nailed it.
Yeah.
Nailed it. Eamon, you want to go next?
I'm Eamon. I'm Seth. My preferred pronouns are he, his, him.
Nailed it. Nice job.
I'm Jesse. We.
Nice to meet you, Jesse. Thanks for coming.
My name is Robert, and male pronouns is fine.
Great. Thanks for coming.
Sure.
My name's Mary, and I'm like this.
Great. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
Report.
I'm Emily, and my preferred pronouns are she and her.
Great. Do you want to join us at the table? It's going to be a pretty interactive presentation, and there's room. So, and I am going to ask you to do things in this presentation. This kind of conversation is one of those ones that can be really wonky and boring if somebody is just standing there lecturing at you. I don't learn that well that way. I know a lot of other folks don't learn well that way, so we're going to do an exercise together. Before we start, though, and talking about how to move policy from a community organizing perspective, there's a couple things that we also still need to get on the same page about. This is one of my favorite quotes about community organizing. It's by Lilla Watson. She is an Indigenous woman from Australia, was born in the 40s, and did a lot of organizing work in Australia on a whole host of topics. This says, if you've come here to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you've come here because your liberation is bound up in mine, then let us work together. Who knows what that means, what she's kind of trying to get at with that quote. Right, Nancy? There's a lot to unpack there, so there's probably no wrong answer when you look at it, but what's the first thing that jumps out at you when you see this?
Hi. Please.
Connection.
Yeah.
Thank you. Hang in there.
Yeah.
And what affects some pelvic pain?
Yeah. Welcome. Do you want to take a seat with us or join us? Thanks for coming. I'm Micah, by the way. Nice to meet you. What's your name?
Lauren?
Nice to meet you, Lauren. What are some other things that jump out at us when we see this?
I would think, again, to just kind of
Oh, okay.
piggyback
We
off
can
of that.
totally do that. I don't know what.
The same reality that if I'm coming here and it's like, hey, you need help out of pity, there's a difference between empathy and sympathy. The fact that if I'm connected, right, if I'm actually, if your plight is part of mine, whether it's through the actual connection of the issue where we share the same race or gender identity or gender or whatever it is that we're talking about, or if it's that I recognize and truly connect to your plight, even though I may not be from it, right? But that your liberation, your freedom, your humanity is intrinsically connected to mine.
That is such a great way of putting that. Thank you for saying that. This is something that Montana Women Vote really cares about. gonna back up a little bit. Montana Women Vote was started in the early 2000s by a group of folks that recognized that in the policy world and in the legislative world, low-income women in particular were not really being upheld. Their values were not being upheld. They were being talked for rather than having opportunities to speak for themselves. So Montana Women Vote started out as a tool to register low-income women to vote so that no legislator could say, I don't have a responsibility to represent these people because they don't vote. It has since from then grown into a pretty large, not large, there's like 2 staff, we're not large. we have a lot of people that are involved in our work, but Montana Women Vote has grown into a pretty useful policy-making organization. We still do voter registration, but the core of what we do is bound up in what Lilla is saying in this quote. It's that our liberation is bound up with one another. The reason why we care about anti-Islamic comments, the reason why we care about whether or not our buildings are ADA accessible, the reason why we care whether or not our politicians are homophobic is because we know that when one person is experiencing oppression, that it means that all of us suffer for it. Does that make sense? So that's what community organizing is about. Really is about bringing communities of people together under the shared understanding that we have a shared fate as a society, that when one group of our society is suffering, that we are all suffering, and that because of that, we have a responsibility and an obligation to come together and stand up for one another. In a lot of ways, that's what today is about, right? Like that's kind of why you're all here, right? Is to talk a little bit about how we can come together as a community and resist some of the awful things that may happen over the course of the next 4 years. I just want to lift this up again, though, because oppression has always existed. Racism has always existed. Xenophobia has always existed. And they're not things that are going to go away unless we collectively make a commitment to organize our communities day in and day out in making change that is actually real and lasting and representative of everyone. So while this is going to be a policy conversation, like we're going to talk about how to move a bill through a legislature, we are going to hold fast to this value that we are better at doing that when we're doing it together. We are better at doing it when there are no individual heroes who are championing our legislation. We are better at doing it, and it makes a better impact on our communities when everyone has the opportunity to say their piece on what legislation means for their lives. Does that make sense? Okay. I thought about going through this piece on shared fate and community organizing, but I feel like we're all on the same page about it. Are we? Yeah? We don't need to go over it anymore? Okay. So, a couple of ground rules. This is an interactive kind of presentation. I want and hope that you step forward and share your thoughts with us and that you participate. If you don't want to, that's okay, but I just want to give a couple ground rules. First is be brave. Often in this work, we're really afraid of making mistakes for fear out of offending somebody, and it is much better to make a mistake and be willing to learn from it than it is to be silent. So please participate and be brave in your participation. What's learned here doesn't stay in the room. Take what you learn, use it somewhere else. One diva, one mic. This is important. If someone's speaking, give them the chance to finish their thought before they continue speaking. And move up and move back. Some of us have personalities that always want to jump in and provide an answer. I am this person, right? That's why I like doing things like this, because I really like participating in group stuff. If you are that person, I really encourage you to take a step back and maybe give space for somebody else to share their thoughts. If you're somebody who often is stepping back and doesn't really say much, I really encourage you to be brave and share what you're thinking with the group as we go through this process together. And have fun, because it's a cheesy presenter thing that you're supposed to put on a flip chart. So here it is for your enjoyment. Have fun. We are going to go through how to move policy. I have an example of equal pay that we're going to go through. We're also going to break up into 2 other groups, and you are going to move through policy by thinking about targets and your messaging and your key messengers and how that fits into the legislative process. But I want to tell you a story first. Who knows about Medicaid expansion in Montana? Yeah. So Montana Women Vote was the organizing arm that pushed the community to advocate for Medicaid expansion. All of the phone calls that legislators received were done by volunteers in the Montana Women Vote office. Every hearing that was packed with hundreds of people came from Montana Women Vote and the Human Rights Network, who is our fiscal sponsors. All of that work happened because of community organizing. Do you remember how big Medicaid expansion was? 70,000 people didn't have health insurance before Medicaid expansion. After Medicaid expansion, 70,000 people did. Yeah.
In Montana?
In Montana, yeah. So Medicaid expansion was part of the Affordable Care Act. When the Affordable Care Act was passed, the Supreme Court determined that the only unconstitutional piece of the Affordable Care Act was asking the states, not asking them, but forcing the states to expand their Medicaid programs to cover a certain set of people. They said that's unconstitutional, you can provide the funding for it, but states have to opt into that. Does that make sense? Okay, hence the fight across many states in the nation for expanded Medicaid. There's a group of people who weren't quite poor enough to be able to get Medicaid on the state level that they currently had. And then they were not quite rich enough to be able to afford subsidies on the Affordable Care Act's marketplace. So there's this group of middle people that didn't have health insurance, and Medicaid expansion sought to expand health coverage for those folks. Who was there in the last legislative session when this was happening? Did anybody have a chance to participate in any of those hearings or anything? Well, let me tell you what. There were hundreds of people that showed up to Helena to lobby their delegation for Medicaid expansion. People came out and shared their personal stories in a way that I've never seen before. Folks called their legislators and were engaged in the process at a level that is pretty unprecedented in a small state like Montana. Proportionally, I've never seen as many people lobbying for legislation as I did during Medicaid expansion. Part of that is because it's healthcare, right? People live and die on whether or not they actually have access to healthcare. It's really important. And part of that is just because there was a lot of really good community organizing across the state happening that mobilized people into sharing their stories. And that's really what I want to highlight in this presentation. Medicaid expansion did not pass because the bill was perfect. Medicaid expansion did not pass because there was one particular legislator that was a champion of Medicaid expansion. Medicaid expansion passed because communities demanded that it passed. Medicaid expansion passed because people stood up and said, you have to do this for me and for my family and for my community. And that's what we're talking about. Yeah.
How was it expanded again to cover the 70,000 that went there?
So they accepted the federal funding to expand the existing state program. So there's like a pool of dollars that the Affordable Care Act created and said, hey, if you want this to expand your programs, you can have it. So our bill essentially accepted those Medicaid dollars and then added a couple provisions that, did this, that, and the other. Yeah.
So who are the main opposing voices to this, or what is the benefit of opting out of Medicaid expansion?
I'm sorry, I missed that last
What
one.
would be the benefit of having opted out of Medicaid expansion?
Yeah, so there really was not a whole lot of benefit to opting out, but I will say that our biggest opposition was Americans for Prosperity. The Koch brothers funded Americans for Prosperity.
Okay.
And the reason why they didn't think that it was a good idea was because it was the Affordable Care Act. Because it's tied to Obamacare. That's
I
why.
have a question about
But
that.
yes,
Sorry to interrupt you.
just one more thing.
No, no, sure.
I will say that this is also one of the few pieces of legislation that I've ever had the opportunity to work on that has had as broad-based support. Like really, our opposition really does come down to Americans for Prosperity and some pretty conservative legislators that just didn't want to see it passed. We had chambers of Commerce that were behind it. A ton of rural hospitals came out and said, hey, we're going to have to close our doors unless we figure out how to take care of uncompensated care costs. Medicaid expansion helps bring in dollars so that those hospitals could stay afloat. It really was an unprecedented level of participation, broad-based support. So it's not for lack of trying to identify opponents in saying that it was some really conservative people that really hated the Affordable Care Act and the Koch brothers, Americans for Prosperity. Yeah.
Would you not say that, I understand that might have been part of the opposition to passing it by Americans for Prosperity, but it's not a blank check. I have a couple of points. One, it's not a blank check for the states. In other words, after so many years, aren't the states then obligated to cover the cost of Medicaid?
Only up to 10%.
Sorry?
Only up to 10%.
Only up to 10%.
Of the full cost, which was actually money that was raised by increased job creation.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
So if the ACA goes forward sort of unmodified, which is maybe a big assumption.
Yeah.
Montana will only be on the hook for covering 10% of the costs of Medicaid forever.
Yes.
Or until the
Funding.
ASA is dismantled or modified or whatever.
Right. Funding of which, it is great, funding of which will likely be paid for by the increased jobs that are created in the healthcare industry because more people are actually accessing the healthcare industry.
Okay.
When 70,000 more people have access to care, it's a job creator, taxes from those jobs help to pay for the
I thought it was
10%.
gonna be sort of titrated down, or in other words, the funding was gonna be gradually reduced, but you're saying
It's gradually increased up to 10% and never goes higher than 10%.
the costs.
That states have to hold on to.
Okay,
You're right.
super.
So, tangent, but good question. It's a question that a lot of people have. So that's kind of the perspective. Medicaid expansion is sort of the perspective in which we're having this conversation, right? Like it's something that a lot of social justice-y minded political groups that really see policy as an opportunity to really affect positive change in our communities like struggle with. Like it's really hard sometimes to find like a super tangible, we expanded healthcare for 70,000 people example of community change. There are examples, right? Like the civil rights movement is a really great example of that. There are obviously really huge examples, but in Montana, this is probably one of the best ones that we've seen in the last decade. We expanded healthcare for 70,000 people, and that came about because of people who did other things using their power and their voice to lobby for policy that made a difference. So that's what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about how to do that. Like once you have your community group together that has this idea of shared values, of shared fate, how you move policy forward. We're going to workshop a couple different ideas. I'm going to ask you to break into 2 groups in order to do it. But this is an example. We're going to start with an example. So let's say that my issue is equal pay. That my group of community members, like people who are really thinking about issues, are saying like, look, y'all, we don't have equal pay. And not just for women, but for racial minorities, for folks with disabilities, for people who don't identify as straight. Like there is a wage gap and we want to do something about it. And you know what? I just realized that in Montana, you can be fired for asking your coworkers how much you make. So you don't even know sometimes whether or not you're facing wage discrimination. So we want to do something about it. As we go through this process, you're going to identify those first values. So in pursuing the policy of equal pay, our values are gender justice. Women make less than men on a dollar. Racial justice. Folks of color make less than white men on the dollar and even less than white women on the dollar. Anti-ableism. Folks with disabilities often make a lot less money than the rest of us. And anti-homophobic, queerphobic, transphobic stuff. There's a lot of queer people who either can't get a job because they're queer or face wage discrimination because they're queer. So those are the overarching values, the things that we know to be true. And in order to begin pushing our policy through, we need to identify targets. We need to come up with an elevator speech that we can use to lobby our legislators. And we need to come up with a couple key messengers. So I have brainstormed 2 things for you all to think about. And the first is,
Can you point out that it has to be smart for the government to actually think about it? Smart being measurable,
Specific, measurable,
yes,
attainable,
attainable,
realistic, timely.
yeah.
So those are all,
Do you want to explain that to everybody a little bit more, what SMART goals are?
and we could jump in on this. Amy.
Oh, it's just a way of,
Got it
it's
as well.
an acronym that is
Okay.
a way of making goals that are basically,
Specific.
well, the acronym is specific, measurable, I think attainable, maybe, and then realistic and timely. So if you have a SMART goal, you cover all those categories and you can, move forward on it. It's not some kind of pie in the sky idea.
Yeah.
Biggest one is measurable. So you have to come up with some sort of framework where it can be measured,
Yep.
as far as progress, or some sort of scale that's observable.
So can you give us an example? Like, let's say that you were going to work on raising the minimum wage. can you like walk us through what you think a SMART goal of the overarching goal to raise the minimum wage would be?
As far as the specific part, that is kind of given, minimum wage. That's given. Measurable. Say we were to raise it by 50 cents, then we would be able to see how, given a year, different economic sectors, if they improve or not, how the businesses do.
One measured against cost of living and.
Cost of living.
You know,
How many people are delinquent on their power bill, that kind of thing.
Yeah. Those are the kind of things that ideally you're coming up with in your community group. We call them coalitions. Montana Women Vote was the only organization that was working on Medicaid expansion. It was a coalition of other organizations. It was Montana Budget and Policy Center, the Montana Human Rights Network, it was SEIU, it was the Montana Primary Care Association, it was the Hospital Association, ironically, and that's the first conversation that you need to have. For the purposes of this workshop, we're going to assume that you've already had that conversation. We're going to assume that you have a goal and a thing that you want to accomplish. And now we're going to talk about the nitty-gritty of how to lobby your legislators, knowing that the SMART goals that you've come up with are in fact SMART, that you have measurables, that you have a specific thing that you are asking them for. Is that fair?
And that's the only way you'll be able to get the message through to the lobbyists to then make it a policy, is if you can speak in the SMART language.
Yeah, that's true. I would argue that there's a couple other things that we're going to talk about in just a second too. So, two groups. One of you is going to be focusing on paid leave, and the other will be focused on raising the minimum wage. Feel free to break yourselves up into two groups. And okay, here are some pens too.
What does paid leave mean?
$30 now. Yeah, like,
Giving people the opportunity to still be making money if they need to take time off in order to care for a sick family member, or maternity leave if they have a baby. Maternity, paternity, sick family, medical leave. Just paid leave is your overarching thing. Feel free in your group to be more specific about it as you go forward. And that's the first thing that I'm asking you to go and decide. You're going to decide on what your values are. You're going to make a SMART goal. Like, this is the thing that we want to do over this overarching goal of raising the minimum wage and providing paid leave for more people. Does that make sense? So the values that we establish in equal pay are, we value gender justice and racial justice. And as we go forward, we want to make sure that people have the opportunity to talk to their coworkers about what they're making. Those are the two things that I want you to come up with. Values and then the specific thing that you want to do. Sound good? 10 minutes. Policy specifics, identifying values. What were some challenges that you encountered? What were some points that you found easy to agree on? Like, what was it like identifying exactly what it is that you're going to do?
It's hard.
Why is it hard?
Just considering the effect it would have on a variety of different people, businesses, and workers. It's difficult to balance that.
Yeah, definitely.
Not as easy just from the hip to take into consideration the bigger, like, the things that would have to be looked at before you move forward with a really sound, like, this is what we want to achieve. For instance, with ours, it was, we looked at, like, you know, what is it? Is it a wage increase across the board? And as soon as you brought that up, or is it 50 employees or more, or what does that look like, you know? And then there's gonna be discussion and, you know, and having to hash that out and on a larger scale.
Yeah.
Especially with a larger group, you know?
Yeah.
Being able to hear a minority voice and, you know, and have, you know,
Yes.
or a committee structure to be able to kind of hash that stuff out would probably streamline that a little more.
Yeah. I think that this is one of the hardest things about working on policy as part of community organizing, because it's the thing that you get hammered on the most from folks who are opposition. And it's also the thing that legislators actually spend the most time verbally talking about are your policy specifics. And when you're doing community organizing, it is a tension that you have to be comfortable in holding, that you listen to everyone in the room, that you take in the variety of perspectives that may not be your own, experiences that may not be your own, while also finding that meeting point with policy that you're trying to do. I mean, thus is the nature of political institutions and being a human in general, right? There's going to be tension. And as you go forward in creating policy, this should always be a conversation that you're willing to revisit. You should always be willing to revisit whether or not what you're being a champion of is actually about communities or whether or not it's become about winning. You should always be a champion about whether or not the policy that you're supporting is actually going to help people, or if it's just gone way too far down in the weeds and is actually only going to help a really specific number of people for the sake of passing any policy rather than a policy that's actually good and actually helps people. It is a difficult conversation to have, and it's one that you will have to continually revisit in coalitions and groups of folks as you move forward in policymaking. Any other challenges or thoughts that people had in this? Did anyone else from this group have any thoughts or challenges? Yeah.
I guess just understanding the baseline of where you start with the demands. Like what is the bare minimum? Like we had to think, okay, well, what do some businesses provide, or what is the sort of common understanding of paternity leave or of paid leave in general in the U.S. and just sort of starting your conversation there. So even getting the ground for like where to start is.
Yeah, definitely difficult. And as you gain new information, like this is why we have round heads instead of squares, so that our thoughts can change and so that we can be malleable with our thinking. As new information comes at you as you're doing policy work, it's really difficult when you're doing stuff in the legislature or at any kind of level of government to be flexible in what it is that you believe and know about the work that you're doing, but it's really important to do. If we're going to do this as community organizing, if we're going to actually have values that embody shared fate, then we have to be willing to listen to other people when we're being given new information and adjust accordingly. So it's difficult. I know that definitely was not enough time to resolve all of the issues with these two very large overarching concepts, but we're going to move forward now. The second...
Can I point out, I know, I keep raising my hand, but when we're talking about policy, most of the time when we're doing it, we'll be speaking about something we all know really well and it's important to us. So we'll know the details of it. And in this exercise, we had to first generate what, like she said, the status quo is. What are we actually talking about?
Yeah, definitely. It's a difficult exercise to do, and it's designed that way. It's supposed to be difficult. It's supposed to be difficult to be given a sheet that says paid leave on it and try to find some kind of common ground on it. This is the nature of political work. I mean, we see that, I think this last election cycle is a really great example of that. There's differences in people that we think alike. There are differences in the way that our values play out into policy. And if we're not willing to revisit our values as they relate to policy, then we can't expect anybody else to either. So we have to be better. We have to hold ourselves to a higher standard to be able to have tough conversations and really mire through what it looks like to do something general and overreaching, like raise the minimum wage or address paid leave or equal pay inequality. So let's move on. Once you've established your coalition, once you have a policy that you're passionate about, once you know that you have a community of folks behind you that also want to work on this policy, you need to establish targets. What do I mean by establish targets? And let's assume for the purposes of this exercise that the Montana legislature is in session, like it is right now. If you wanted to establish a group of targets that you wanted to have folks talking to and lobbying, who would they be? There were a stack of sheets on this.
Yeah.
Here.
Yeah.
Yeah, so let's do it on the equal pay one first. If I wanted to establish targets for passing equal pay legislation that made it so that employees can talk about their wages without being fired for it, let me use this, Eamon, if it's okay with you. Who would my targets be? Let's start generally. Start generally. The legislature. More specifically in the legislature, It's good to have House majority, minority, same thing with Senate. Those are your people that are whipping their caucuses. You can also have caucus whips that you can talk to too, but those are like the people who have the most support behind them. That's why they have leadership positions. Those are people that you want to add to your target list. Let's drill down a little bit more. A policy like equal pay, if you look to this sheet that I just passed around, this is a list of committees that are in the legislature right now. This isn't all of them. There's a lot of appropriations subcommittees, but this is like a general overview of the committees that are meeting in the legislature right now. And the one that I think is really important for us to think about as targets are business and labor. Both in the House and in the Senate. Can we even like drill that down a little bit more? Like what would be other targets within that committee itself?
Well, I mean, the Democrats will probably go for it, so.
You'd be surprised. A lot of Democrats this week in the legislature voted for some pretty terrible policing legislation. So I would not rule them out as targets.
Oh, I said the Democrats would probably go for it, but.
No.
So-
It's in that. Oh, there was, the policing bill was to,
We'll talk about it later. But I guess my point is that you shouldn't rule out people based on party, because people who you may think agree with you may not actually agree with you. And sometimes the people who do agree with you still need support from their communities. They still need to hear, like, you're doing the right thing. Thanks for having a spine and defending this legislation. So I would say don't define it by party. What else? I would say the committee chair. They're the person that's going to decide whether or not your bill actually gets a hearing. So they're a pretty important person to think about. And the same is true for both committees. You want to do this in the House and the Senate. Your bill will start in one place and maybe not another. So focus in on your committee first. Let's say then that your bill has made it out of committee. Let's say this equal pay bill has made it out of committee. Who should be our new targets? We're in the House. We had a really great hearing at the House Business and Labor Committee. It's now going to go to the House floor. Who should be our next list of targets?
the responsible Republicans.
Responsible Republicans.
That was the group of Republicans that voted for Medicaid expansion.
I would call them movable.
Yeah.
We always do this in any policy that we pursue. We're pursuing paid leave legislation right now, actually, ironically. You're helping me a lot by doing this. Thank you, group over here. We're also pursuing an earned income tax credit legislation right now. So when we think about what a bill looks like once it's down on the floor, we think about movable targets. Who are people that could be deciding votes on this legislation? Who are the people who've absolutely made up their minds and that we don't need to spend any time on? Who are the people that maybe are on our side but need some more support? So all of that is about identifying your movable targets. Last person that we should add to our list of targets if we're doing state legislation. The big kahuna.
State senator?
Yeah, our state senator would be part of this. Your senator,
Speaker of the House?
Governor.
the governor. And the Speaker of the House. No leader of the Senate. But the governor. Why is the governor important?
He's the president of the state.
Yep. Why else?
Veto power?
Excuse me?
Veto power?
Veto power. Just because you pass good legislation does not mean that it gets signed into law. This is the final person that you need to be lobbying. And oftentimes I will say, let's be honest, this whole exercise is a really simple way of going through the process that we do every time we look at policy. But it's simple. Oftentimes, the governor and the governor's staff is who you want to talk to first before the legislature convenes, usually the summer before, even prior to his or her reelection. This is somebody that you want making sure cares about what you're doing, especially if what you're doing costs money. If what you're doing costs money, then you really want the governor to include it in his or her funding bill, the appropriations bill. So something to think about. The governor should be on your target list. So now that we've done this for equal pay and kind of thought about business and labor, who in the House and the Senate we should target, I kind of want to think about this in terms of No, we'll get there next. Do this for your stuff, and then you're going to share with us what you've come up with. So come up with who the target people are, pick out your committees, identify who it is that you really want to drill down on when your community members go to lobby the legislature, when they make phone calls, who is it that the phone call should be directed to. Have that conversation. Identify your targets. We'll do 5 minutes on this. Confusing. It depends on where legislation starts. We often don't know where our legislation will start, too. Like, it's a big question mark, but this is generally how it works. Starts in the committee, goes to one of the branches. Once it passes through that branch, then it goes to the opposite one. Once that branch has passed it, both through their committee and their larger body, then it goes to the governor.
We vote something into law,
And employee for 6 weeks.
just going around.
Yes.
In the project.
It's a citizen ballot initiative.
Right.
Yeah, ballot initiatives are how you circumvent this process. Also, executive orders are how you circumvent this process too. So like, when Barack Obama signed an order saying that recently that Cubans can no longer be naturalized U.S. citizens. Like he signed an executive order without any legislation saying that you're not automatically an American if you're Cuban and you just like touch down on soil. So it's like a law that is just decreed by either the president or the governor. And there's some things that you can do that for and other things that you can't. And often they end up challenged in court. So, yeah.
Fair enough, thank you.
Yeah, of course. Have you guys identified targets? How's that going? What do we have so far?
We do not. I think that there was like some, yeah, there was,
Oh yeah, business and labor, I see that.
oh yeah.
House and then to the Senate, identifying our movables, I'm sorry.
So, Kaden, to this, I would think one House Committee on Taxation, I think
But I mean, I think that lives that just long term and make the legislation.
Yeah, it would be like, think of it as like what committee is gonna preside over the law.
Okay.
So taxes will increase by an increase to the minimum wage, but you guys were probably right in identifying it as part of business and labor.
You're supporting families.
Oh, I see, we're just talking about the specific, who's
Yep,
gonna introduce
targets.
the bill into the committee?
Yeah, and just thinking about like as you're lobbying people, like as you have folks calling the legislature, like who do you want them to call? Like I want them to call Representative Fitzpatrick. I want them to call Representative Curtis. I want them to call the governor and make sure that the governor is on board with it. So like who are those people that you're going to identify as the folks that you need to focus on? And the reason that committees are on here too is that you can leave a message for a whole committee. Like you can leave a message saying everybody on business and labor, I want you to support this. But we're going to drill down too. So think of it as like you want the House minority and majority leaders, same with the Senate. You want your committee on board, both in the House and the Senate. You want your senator on board. You also don't want to exclude people based on their party because that's often not reliable. You want movable targets, folks that you know are willing to at least listen and maybe change their ideas. So that's kind of what we're doing. Just identifying like who your targets are as you put people out and say, hey, I need you to call your legislator. These are the legislators you need to actually call. Like this is what will not be a waste of your time. Make sense? Okay, a couple more minutes on that then. Why doesn't this group go first? Bye, Eamon. Good to see you. What did you guys identify as your targets?
So, business and labor, who we have in the House and the Senate that we would reach out to specifically, who's in the move one, and the point that was just brought up is if we had anybody within our committee who knew somebody, say specifically that they had worked with in the past on any of these committees, say it was transportation, and they were a great one that was brought up, is that we could, if it's not somebody who's necessarily movable, but we could get information, we could be able to find out who, other stuff, we could be able to flesh out a bigger picture by using, any other relationship that could be like that.
And then, that's great. And then obviously the people who are movable in the larger chambers and the governor too.
Yeah.
How about this group?
I mean, we felt that business and labor was gonna be a target because of I would say because of the cost to businesses of providing paid leave.
Yep.
We felt that health and human services was a target, for kind of obvious reasons when you talk about paid paternity leave or being a caretaker. We talked about, under Senate committees, business, labor, and economic affairs, insofar.
Hey, are you guys hearing this? Your committee could have gone under business, labor, and economic affairs too. I didn't think of that. I think equal pay could have gone under business, labor, and economic affairs too.
We felt that also under Senate committees, it could come under public health, welfare and safety. Certainly, I would say public health and welfare. Do you want to did you want to make an argument for that, or?
In state administration, none of us know the status quo of what paid leave is right now for the state. So depending on what that is, talk to somebody in the state administration House Committee that can give us a really good lowdown on what it is and how they managed to get that policy as what it is now.
That's a great thought. There's a lot of states that have precedent for using the state as the model for paid leave. They do it as think of it as like state insurance for paid leave. So that's a good idea. Montana doesn't have anything like that outside of municipalities right now, but it's definitely good to check in with those guys. And your group raises a great point. Just because your legislation is in one committee doesn't mean that it will stay in one committee. Your legislation you could think could end up in one committee, could go to another. Totally dependent upon the bill sponsor, totally dependent upon the committee. So it's good to keep an open mind about what committees you're identifying and where you're thinking about your targets being. So the next thing that we're going to talk about is an elevator speech. Once you've identified who needs to be lobbied on behalf of your legislation, you need to know what to say. We call this an elevator speech. Has everybody heard that term before? Yeah, some of us had heard the term before. The reason it's called an elevator speech is because folks at the legislature and in Congress are often moving from one place to another. They're really busy. Their schedules are really packed up. And often when you're lobbying them, you're actually walking with them from one place to the next. I've had dozens of legislators say, I don't have time to stand here and talk with you, walk with me. And that's how they'll say it. Like they're not gonna try and make it an easy conversation. They're gonna make you walk with them. They're gonna only have 30 seconds for you to make your point. So that's what we're gonna talk about now. We are going to develop elevator speeches for each one of these policies. And let me give you an example through the one that I came up with. Hi, Senator, my name is Micah. I want to talk to you and ask you to vote in favor of the Paycheck Fairness Act, Senate Bill 158. The act prohibits employers from retaliating against employees who disclose their wage, salary, and benefits information. The act addresses gender and racial inequality by opening the door for greater wage transparency, which increases the likelihood that Montanans will receive equitable compensation for their efforts. And it also helps them support their families and provides an economic boost to local economies. What was good about that? What was bad about it? I'm open to criticism also.
I don't know that somebody would maybe follow that whole paragraph of an elevator speech as opposed to bullet points.
Maybe.
So I mean, if they were walking with you and they were going to a committee meeting, perhaps they would follow that whole thought process or argument.
Yeah.
But I mean, maybe they would. I don't know.
Yeah, that's fair. Sometimes people will, sometimes they won't. So there's a couple things that you should make sure that you do if you're going to bullet point it, if you're going to hand them something, if you're going to give them an elevator speech. This is the best way that I've found to do it that makes the most sense for the culture up at the legislature. But anything that works for you is going to be the best way to deliver whatever it is that you have to say. Things you need to include. 1, name the legislation. Paycheck Fairness Act, Senate Bill 158. That was a bill that was going through the last legislative session. You can feel free to make up your own Senate bill number, but in any elevator speech that you're doing, you need to make sure that you state the bill number and the name of the bill so that they know what you're talking about, even if they're not going to hear or listen to the rest of what you're saying. The second thing is that it talks about what the act does. It gives the legislator, in a nutshell, what that act provides for. The reason that this is important is because there's a lot of legislation that happens up at the Capitol. Ideally, our legislators are reading every bill, right? That's what we as citizens would hope is happening. But again, one of those things that you would assume and can't guarantee 100%. So it's good to explain to them what the act actually provides for. The third thing that I would add is that you should have something about your values. It's not just about what the act does, it's why you care about what the act does. It's the values that you identified at the top of your sheet, right? And you should mold that into your elevator speech, because it makes it a more powerful elevator speech. If it's not personal, if it's not about something that you actually care about, then you may as well just be an encyclopedia reading. You know, like, make it about you, make it personal, make it about your values, because that is going to be the thing that gets somebody to actually stop and listen to you. The next thing that I would say is that it, again, shows what it will do, but through a values-focused perspective. Does that make sense? Like, this is why this is important. These are the values that I care about that make it important, and that's why this is going to solve this problem that I've identified and that I think is contrary to my values.
You've broadened it out a little bit so
Yeah.
that I, as the legislator, can see the validity of the value for more than just you.
Yeah, that's true.
For a broader community.
And I'll say, let me just give you all an example. During the last legislative session, there was this one particular legislator who was representing East Missoula, and he was adamantly against the idea of Medicaid expansion. He thought that it was an entitlement program that was only going to be used for by Lady Z students. He was 100 million% against it. Basically every week through the course of the legislative session, we brought up low-income women from his district to talk to him and give this same elevator speech. And he would give, more often than not, the same answer and over again. And the reason why we still kept talking to him is because we had a coalition partner who knew that he was good on some things sometimes, but we didn't have a lot of hope for him. Every week somebody came up and said, hey, I want you to vote for this. This is why I want you to vote for it. It matters for me and my family. Every single week. The last vote on the House, third reading of this legislation, this legislator, who had been adamantly opposed to it the entire time during the legislative session, stood up on the House floor and said, I can't not vote for this. I have had too many people from my district saying that it's going to affect them and their families, and I can't in good conscience not vote for this. So don't take this lightly. Like, if we're going to take the time to try and practice and move those elevator speech muscles, like, take it seriously, because I have seen this make change. I have seen this work on legislators, and it meant that 70,000 people got health care. So in your groups, and you can do it individually, but I encourage you to do it as a group just to make sure that you don't miss anything. Come up with an elevator speech. Make a compelling 30-second at longest speech about why your legislation is important and that they should vote for it. Yes, it's complicated, it's hard. We're gonna give maybe 20 minutes to this exercise. Yeah. We'll do 15 minutes. But we do need to move on. So I would like to have one person volunteer to share their elevator speech with us. Does one person want to share their elevator speech?
Okay, I will read what I have.
Okay, let's act it out too. Like, you can read it, but like, let's pretend that I'm a legislator, like on my way to do things that I think are more important than listening to you, and you have to like move with me as you give me your elevator speech, right? Okay, so I'm just like standing here.
Okay, can I talk to you about this paid leave bill?
Yeah, can you walk with me while you?
I want to ask you to support the paid leave bill, SB 160.
Yeah.
The bill provides 6 weeks of paid caregiver leave for all employees who work in Montana.
Yep.
The bill will support families, keep more women and minorities and people with disabilities in the workplace, which will decrease employee turnover and boost the Montana economy.
Okay. All right. Thanks for your time. I appreciate it. Okay. Thank you for being willing to like do that with me. That was great. I really liked it. Obviously, when you're doing your elevator speech, that's probably what's going to happen to you. Like, they're going to ask you to walk with them. There'll be like 50 other people surrounding them. But like, that's why it's important to make it super short and sweet. I really liked what you had to say. Would you mind reading it just one more time for us outside of that little demonstration?
Okay. I want to ask you to support the paid leave bill, SB 160. The bill provides 6 weeks of paid caregiver leave for all employees who work in Montana. The bill will support families, keep more women and minorities and people with disabilities in the workplace, which will decrease employee turnover and boost the Montana economy.
That's great. It's like a lot packed into a few sentences. It's impressive. Like, pros and cons. What do we think is good? What do we think could stand to have some improvements? We call it pluses and deltas when we're doing this work. It's a plus, what's a delta? And a delta is just something that needs improvement.
Just as a devil's advocate, I brought up the word minority in the workplace for somebody who might not be interested in the bill. They're doing other things, walking around. That word will catch if they are not in line with the bill, and they'll just stick on that. And they might stop and say, well, how does this bill keep minorities in the workplace?
I mean, one would hope that that's a question that they would ask. I would think you could turn it on its head. Like, if you're so skeptical about minorities, one, should you be somebody that I'm trying to lobby? Two, is it an opportunity to share my values with them? And three, turn the question on its head. Like, yeah, let's have a conversation about why this is important to minorities. What else? Did you have your hand raised?
Well, I liked how short and succinct it was and just have it
Full
along.
of detail.
Yeah, it was super detailed in like a short amount of time. It was perfect. It was like you were tweeting it in addition to just elevator speeching it. I liked it.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, well, naturally. The one thing that I would say is that like it is helpful to also make it personal. Like say this is important to me because also this. Like maybe add one sentence on like why it's personally really important to you. I wish we could all share our elevator speech stories. Do we feel like we understand what makes a good elevator speech though and how to use that to move your targets that we've identified? We all feel like at least like sort of comfortable or at least understanding of what that looks like? Okay. And I will say too that elevator speeches depend on the person. Like as you're bringing folks up to the legislature to lobby on issues, this is constantly changing. And this elevator speech training is one that we go through with every group that we take up to the legislatures.
How will it change?
It depends on the person. Like for their, yeah, so when we were talking about paid leave over in this group, I said, yeah, I'm gonna do an elevator speech that is specific, but I have some pretty personal experiences with needing paid leave. I was my grandfather's primary caregiver, and so was my mom. So saying like not having to make the choice between whether or not we needed a paycheck or whether or not he needed us to take care of him, like that's not a choice the family should have to make. So it changes with each issue and it changes on the individual, and that is the nature of community organizing. The things that you work on mean different things to different people, and giving people the opportunity to be the ones who are lobbying for their legislation rather than paying for one person to do the lobbying means that legislators get to hear the variety of perspectives and the variety of reasons as to why policy change matters. So it's important to infuse it with things that are impactful to you. Like chances are your legislator, particularly if they're a member of that committee, knows some of the policy specifics. They know a little bit as to the general arguments of why it's important. So this is your opportunity to be your own best advocate for the policies that you care about. Okay. Moving on, because we don't have a ton of time left. Do you mind if we just move on?
Yeah.
Okay. Let's identify key messengers now. Who are key messengers? Do we know what key messengers are?
No.
Anybody just have like a general idea?
For instance, my mother has been lobbying in Iowa state legislature so that, as a lobbyist, so that medical bills do not go against your credit. And she's been very active in doing that. She would be a key messenger, if I'm understanding key messenger correctly.
Yeah.
Because she does have medical conditions and she doesn't want it to in fact affect credit, other people's credit even. So in a way, the key messenger needs to be somebody who is affected by the policy.
Yes, absolutely. Your first and most prominent key messenger is the person who is experiencing the problem that you are trying to solve. You should always, in every hearing, in every committee meeting that you have, you should always have space and opportunity for people who are suffering the most from whatever it is that you're trying to correct. Be the people who are speaking first. Who else are some key messengers? I'll offer some examples. So for equal pay and any kind of like minimum wage increase or paid leave stuff, it's good to have business allies there. Like small businesses or the Chamber of Commerce. Sometimes it's good to have like hospitals, and hospitals are one of the largest employers in Montana. And if you have the hospital association or a lobbyist for the hospitals, come and say something on behalf of your bill, it can be helpful. Who else?
Can you identify people who can influence the legislators, like more than a citizen could? Maybe someone who's close to the legislator in some way?
It's a really great thought. And this
Family
actually
member.
happened to us last legislative session. I was at a phone bank with some volunteers, and we were calling people saying like, "Hey, will you tell your legislator that this is important?" And I got on the phone with this woman, and she was like, "Wait, you want me to call who?" And I was like, "This person." And she was like, "Oh, that's my brother. Yeah, I'll be at the hearing because he needs to vote for this." And he had been identified as a target. I mean, this is the nature of doing political work in Montana too, right? Like, we're a big, small town sometimes, so.
I don't necessarily need family members, but just like people who are not in the legislature necessarily, but that they are connected to, that they trust or value the opinions of.
Trusted people.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. And obviously, like, you don't want to be calling a legislators like family members intentionally and being like, "Hey, do this." Yeah, don't do that. But trusted people, people that the legislators trust. A good example of someone that legislators may trust are governor's staff that run numbers on different policies that the governor supports. Policy experts, like people who work on really wonky political stuff, are people that are good to have as testifiers. And you can even like drill this down. For equal pay, I would definitely want to have somebody who had been fired before for asking their coworkers what it is that they were making. You would want women who this has impacted make a testimony. You would want any other folks that you're identifying as like having suffered on behalf of the policy. That's really what you mean. What we mean, and you can super drill down into this. Ideally, though, this is part of the group that's organizing the work, right? Like, it's led from within. The key messengers, the people who are leading the movement, are the people who are most affected by whatever's happening. So something to keep in mind. You can really drill down into some of these things. For paid leave stuff, often moms, like new moms or women who are pregnant, are really good key messengers to have at a hearing testifying. When it comes to minimum wage workers. Like, you want people who are currently on minimum wage to be making the case for that policy. And I think that this is challenging for us sometimes too. Like, as a lot of us folks that think about a lot of this work all the time, as some of us who like, my job is to think about this work, it requires us to step back. It requires us to care about how many voices in the room rather than whether or not our voice is the loudest. And like, it requires a little bit of humility on our parts to make sure that everybody else has their opportunity to be heard rather than whoever has the most power in that moment being heard. So real quick, we only have a couple minutes. In like 3 minutes, write down a couple identified key messengers on your topic. We'll share them together, and then we're going to close our time together. Who your key messengers were. Let's start with this group. Go for it.
We thought that minimum wage workers and family members who've experienced debt because of minimum wage being so low would provide the most emotionally impactful speech. And then we thought if we could identify a small business that stands with the value that we're promoting, that they would be good.
Definitely.
Chamber of Commerce,
Yes,
and then the
definitely.
students.
Yes, all of those and more. All of that's
And
great.
more. Yeah, we didn't get any further.
Yeah, no, that's perfect. That's great. Nice job. What about y'all over here?
Oh gosh, am I? So we talked about having moms come in, and also dads, because we framed it as caregiver leave. Then other caregivers of people who are maybe, I think we talked specifically about dementia, but anyone who's caring for someone who's elderly or experiencing something like dementia, minimum wage, and I forgot, we added some other things, I didn't write them down.
One thing we
Those
did,
are all great.
Yeah.
a constituent of whoever they're speaking with.
Yeah, definitely. That's a good distinction to make too. If you're lobbying versus at a hearing, it's much more impactful to have somebody that votes in that district lobbying the legislator as opposed to just anybody. But the targets that you identified, the key messengers that you identified are definitely true. And I like that you identified fathers as well in addition to that. And it's a broader topic. All of these topics are broad. You want everybody there to give credence to the case that you're trying to make at the legislature. So we're out of time. But I just want to wrap up all of this by saying this is a difficult exercise to go through. Like we all of us have different perspectives on how all of this could look. We have different ideas of what an elevator speech looks like. We have different ideas on what perfect policy looks like. And thus is the nature of community organizing when you're trying to do policy work. It requires you to be able to hold multiple truths and reconcile them with values as you work forward on policy that actually matters for our communities. And that at the end of the day, holding this true means that you are passing policy that is beneficial to communities, knowing that our liberation is bound up in one another, that passing minimum wage matters for our whole community, that making sure that we have paid leave and equal pay opportunities for everyone matters for our whole community, and holding that as the truth behind everything that you do is going to make your case that much more powerful. And also remember, Medicaid expansion is proof that this happens in Montana. That when hundreds and thousands of Montanans come together to lobby on behalf of policy that actually matters for our communities, that we can make change. It's difficult to believe, particularly now sometimes, right? When we feel like we're constantly fighting uphill battles. In Montana, we're always fighting an uphill battle. It is not the first time that we've faced down Goliath and defeated him before. And we can do this. We can hold community organizing as a value and make impactful policy change regardless of political climate, because we've done it before and we'll do it again. And the way that it happens is by uplifting everyone in our communities. Thank you for sitting through an hour-and-a-half presentation and for your willingness to participate with one another through it. It's again difficult and I really appreciate you. So thanks.
You're here.
Of course.